What is going on, guys? Jeff here for Corals Unlimited. Today we're going to be taking a look at the top 10 corals to avoid for a Nano Reef Tank. But before we jump into that, if this is your first time being here, this is where I talk about everything reef tank related. So if you love the reef like I do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell so you can be notified every single time that I upload a new video. Let's go. Coming in at number 10, we have the almighty war coral. Now, the name implies these guys don't play nice with their neighbors. So you want to make sure that you give them plenty of room. And that's one of the things that you are lacking in a Nano Reef Tank. These guys have sweeper tentacles that can come out at night and they can be several inches long. So you want to make sure that if you put them in your tank that they have plenty of space and are not going to sting their neighbors. Another consideration to make with this coral is they prefer water a little bit on the dirtier side. They'll actually do better in tanks with higher nitrates and higher phosphates. That's typically because you find them in dirtier parts of the reef. And in the Nano Reef Tank, that can be really hard to pull off. And last but not least, these guys can grow relatively well once they settle in. So that may make them problematic in a smaller reef tank. Coming in at number 9 on corals to avoid for a Nano Reef Tank, we have the chalice. Now these guys, very similar to the war corals, can be a bit on the aggressive side. They got sweeper tentacles that come out at night, and they are very long in comparison even to the war coral. And again, space will be an issue with these guys, and dealing with a confined space, obviously that's a problem that will play itself out eventually. Something else to consider about this coral is that they are very sensitive to water quality fluctuations. They like the stabilities, and they want that alkalinity, that calcium, that magnesium, all to be relatively consistent. And in a Nano Reef Tank, things can change very fast. So if you're not staying on top of your water changes and your testing and making sure that everything is where it needs to be, this might not be the ideal coral for a Nano Reef Tank. Coming in at number 8 on our top 10 corals that you should avoid for a Nano Reef Tank, we got the Paleotha. Now, not all pallies should be considered to have paleotoxin, but they all really should be handled as if they do have paleotoxin. And if you're unfamiliar with paleotoxin, do a search on that and educate yourself on that, because you could get yourself in a world of hurt if you are not on the up and up. Now, Paleotha, not all of them have paleotoxin, but all of them should be handled as if they do have paleotoxin, just to protect yourself. But the big problem with pallies is their growth rate, and it's usually the ugly ones that grow super, super fast. So not only do you have a coral that may not be the most aesthetically pleasing, it's going to be the one that grows the fastest, obviously, and potentially choke out other corals, which is a no-go. And that's why they're on this top 10. Now, this one hurts me a little bit to put on a corals to avoid list because it's one of my most favorite corals, and that is the Acropora. These guys are incredibly highly sensitive to water quality fluctuations. Again, smaller reef tank, you're going to deal with fluctuations on the regular. They do require high light and also high flow, which could be a little bit problematic in a smaller tank. And then last but not least, they are prone to rapid tissue and slow tissue necrosis, which is usually stemming around water quality issues. And again, when you're picking out corals for a Nano Reef Tank, you want to pick stuff that's going to hang in there and be a little bit resilient. It hurts my soul. It hurts my soul. Acroporas, not ideal for a Nano Reef Tank. Coming in at number 6 on our top 10 corals to avoid in a Nano Reef Tank, we have the good old Goniopora. Now, these guys are considered a moderate level to difficult in their care requirements, and that really can be negated to a large degree, especially if you're buying aquacultured gonies. And I would strongly recommend that if you are falling in love with gonies, make sure what you're buying isn't wild caught and it is in fact aquaculture. That's going to help you out tremendously in the success with this coral. And they also like to be fed too, and that can be kind of hard to nail down in a Nano Reef Tank, because if you're constantly trying to feed a coral, that can junk up the water and lead to water quality issues, which is also going to make it hard to keep this coral and others. Coming in at number 5 in our top 10 corals to avoid in a Nano Reef Tank is the Favia. Now, this is one of my other favorites, just because there's so many different types of them, this being one of my favorites. the yellow submarine. These guys are aggressive in their nature. They do have sweeper tentacles, not quite as long as what you would see with some of the other corals that we've talked about on this list, but they do need a bit of space from their neighbors and can do a little bit of chemical warfare, and not all favias play nicely with other favias, something to keep in mind. They are, as far as, their water requirements, they want stability, but they also like higher nutrient levels, which can be kind of hard to pull off in the Nano Reef Tank. And, the growth rate, once they kind of get going, can be a little on the cray-cray side, just saying. So, beautiful coral nonetheless, but maybe not the best candidate for a Nano Reef Tank. Coming in at number 4 in our top 10 corals to avoid in a Nano Reef Tank, we had the Hydnophoron. Now, I've kept these guys. They are very interesting, especially when you look at them up close, like this macro lens shot. But be fooled not. These guys are extremely aggressive. Like on a scale from 1 to 10, they're like a 15. And not to mention, this coral can grow relatively fast, can be kind of hard to control, especially how fast it will actually grow once it settles in. They do also require higher light and higher flow, which is not always the best candidate for a Nano Reef Tank, especially if you got other guys in there that have other needs. Coming in at number 3 on our top 10, we have the bird's nest. Now, the bird's nest is a very beginner-friendly coral, but there are some situations to be aware of, especially if you're considering them for a Nano Reef Tank. They are a very well-known beginner-friendly SPS coral. The bigger problem with them is that they can grow so fast that they can actually use up all of the trace elements within the water and actually start to die off. So if you're not on top of your water changes, there's a good chance that you'll have a colony, it'll grow really big, and then just all of a sudden die off. And obviously if it's stripping nutrients out of the water for themselves, they're doing it for other corals too. So that might be a coral to avoid. And coming in at number 2, one that surprised probably a lot of folks that it wasn't number 1, and that is green star polyps. Now, these guys grow incredibly fast. They're one of the fastest growing corals out there, and they can very quickly overtake rocks. They can grow on anything. They can grow on glass, sandbed. They don't care. They crazy like that. They also, once they are established, can be relatively difficult to remove. So a lot of folks, I try to keep them away from this coral. But if they got to have them, I usually try to tell them to put it on a isolated island so it can't spread at its will. And even if it does start to spread off the island a little bit, you can always trim it back and then trade it to a friend, I guess, that doesn't have a Nano Reef Tank or they don't care. But yeah, this coral can get out of hand, and that's why we want to avoid it in the Nano Reef Tank. And coming in at number 1 on our top 10 corals to avoid in the Nano Reef Tank, we have the good old Monipora. Now, these guys are a great beginner SPS coral, but I don't recommend them for a Nano Reef Tank. Has a lot to do with the fact that they can grow relatively fast and also dominate space. So they're going to shadow any coral that's below it, and that is going to be a problem. They're also sensitive to water parameter fluctuations. They're like most SPS corals. They're a little bit more forgiving, but they still want that calcium, that alkalinity, and that magnesium in range so it can grow fast. Now, just because you have some of these corals in your Nano Reef Tank doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. Just make sure that you stay on top of it. You should be fine. But if you want to learn more about Nano Reef Tanks, check this video out. I will see you over there.